The Whiteout Wanderer. It was supposed to be a quick trip to visit family for the holidays, but the snowstorm came out of nowhere. The radio had warned about worsening conditions, but we thought we'd make it through before it hit. We were wrong. By nightfall, the car was buried in snow, and the wind howled like a living thing. My wife sat in the passenger seat, clutching a blanket around her shoulders, while our son dozed fitfully in the back. The heater was on low to conserve gas, and the cold seeped in through every crevice. The world outside the windshield was a swirling mass of white. You couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. Every now and then I flicked on the high beams, but it only made the storm seem more impenetrable. We'd called for roadside assistance hours ago, but no one had come. "I think I saw something," my wife said suddenly, her voice tight with unease. I glanced up. At first I saw nothing but snow. Then, faintly, a shadow moved across the storm just at the edge of the headlights. "Probably just a tree," I said, though I wasn't sure. Minutes passed, and the shadow appeared again, this time closer. It was a person, or at least it looked like one. They were walking against the wind, their movements slow but deliberate. "They must be lost," my wife whispered. Should we help?" I rolled down the window an inch, and the icy air bit at my skin. "Hey!" I called out, but the figure didn't respond. They just kept walking, circling the car like they were searching for something. Something about the way they moved made my stomach twist. Their steps were too smooth, too steady, for the conditions outside. No one could walk like that in a storm like this. "Lock the doors," I said, my voice low. "Why?" my wife asked, but she obeyed. The figure stopped directly in front of the car, just beyond the headlights. For the first time, I got a good look at them, or tried to. They were wrapped in a tattered coat, their face obscured by a hood. The snow didn't seem to touch them. It swirled around their body like they were part of the storm itself. "Hello?" I tried again, louder this time. No answer. They tilted their head, as if studying us. Then they took a step forward. "No," my wife whispered. The figure pressed their hands against the hood of the car, their fingers splayed out. The metal groaned under the weight, even though they didn't look heavy. Frost spread across the glass like a living thing, spidering toward the edges of the windshield. I slammed the car into reverse, but the tires spun uselessly in the snow. "Come on," I muttered, panic rising. The figure lifted their head. Their face, or what should have been their face, was an empty void. Just blackness, like staring into the depths of a frozen lake. "They're not human," my wife said, her voice shaking. The frost reached the windows, thickening until we could barely see out. The figure disappeared into the storm, but I knew they were still there. The car trembled, not from the wind, but from the weight of something pressing down on it. And then, as quickly as it had begun, the frost melted away. The storm outside grew quieter, as if the figure had taken it with them. We sat in stunned silence until the distant hum of an engine broke through. A snowplow appeared, its lights cutting through the whiteout, and relief flooded me. When the driver pulled up beside us, I rolled down the window, the air biting at my skin once more. "You folks okay?" he asked, his face weathered and kind. I nodded, but my voice was shaky. "Did you see anyone else out there?" The driver frowned. "No one. You're the only ones for miles." We didn't speak about it again as the plow led us back to safety. But as we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't truly escaped. Out there, in the endless white, the figure was still watching, waiting for the next unlucky travelers to cross their path. The Snowstorm Carnival. It started as a picturesque evening, with snow softly falling as the carnival set up on the outskirts of a small village. We'd been traveling for weeks, and this place felt like a reprieve. The locals welcomed us with curiosity, and the children were thrilled by the Ferris wheel, the games, and the bright spinning lights cutting through the winter gloom. But the storm came fast. By nightfall, the snow had turned into a blizzard. Roads disappeared under thick drifts, and we were stranded. The villagers offered what they could, rooms, food, warmth, but there weren't enough places for all of us. A few of us decided to stay in the carnival tents, figuring the storm would blow over by morning. It didn't. I was sharing a tent with two others, Marta the fortune teller and Greg, who ran the ring toss. The wind howled like a wild animal, shaking the canvas walls and cutting through every gap. Sleep was impossible, so we sat bundled in layers, telling stories to pass the time. Around midnight, we heard footsteps crunching outside. At first, I thought it might be someone from the village checking on us, but the steps were oddly deliberate, too slow, too measured. "Who would be out in this storm?" Marta whispered, her breath fogging the air. I unzipped the tent and peered out. Snow swirled violently, making it hard to see, but there was someone, or something, standing near the Ferris wheel. They were tall and unmoving, their form indistinct under the heavy snow. "Probably just a villager," Greg muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. But then, more figures appeared. One by one, they emerged from the storm, standing among the carnival attractions. I counted 6, maybe 7. Something about them was off. They didn't shiver or shift. They just stood there, as if waiting. Marta gasped, pointing toward the Ferris wheel. "That one! It looks like me!" I squinted through the whiteout and felt my stomach drop. The figure near the Ferris wheel was dressed in a flowing cloak, just like Marta's fortune-teller garb. And then I saw another one wearing Greg's distinctive red scarf. "This isn't real," Greg said, but his face was pale. The figures began to move, slow and deliberate, their steps crunching through the snow. They weren't just wandering, they were coming closer. Panic set in. We zipped the tent shut and huddled together, whispering frantic plans. Marta wanted to run for the village, but I wasn't sure we'd make it in the storm. Greg suggested staying put and waiting it out, though his voice trembled. Then the zipper of the tent began to move. We froze as the fabric parted, revealing a hand. No, not a hand. It was pale and stiff, like sculpted ice. The figure outside looked exactly like Marta, down to the faint gold chain around its neck. It reached for her, its frozen fingers stretching out. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Marta's arm and dragging her out of the tent. We stumbled through the snow, the wind blinding us. Behind me, I heard Greg scream. When I turned, the figure in the red scarf had dragged him down, its icy form merging with his body until he stopped moving. We ran toward the village, barely able to see through the storm. Marta tripped, and when I helped her up, her cloak was frozen solid, as if the snow itself was trying to claim her. We made it to the edge of the village, where the lights from the houses flickered weakly through the storm. The figures didn't follow us past the carnival grounds, but I could still feel their presence, watching, waiting. By morning, the storm had passed. We returned to the carnival to find it eerily silent. The tents were intact, but everyone else was gone. The Ferris wheel creaked gently in the breeze, and frozen footprints crisscrossed the snow, leading away from the village. I don't know what those things were or why they came during the storm, but I do know this. They weren't just trying to replace us. They were becoming us. And somewhere out there, the carnival is still traveling, bringing its performers and their replacements to the next unsuspecting town. The Shifting Shadows. It was supposed to be a simple winter hike, just a few hours through the snowy trails before heading back to the lodge. But the storm came out of nowhere. What started as a light snowfall turned into a relentless blizzard. The wind howled, visibility vanished, and the biting cold seeped through every layer of clothing. We were lucky to find the cabin, if you could call it that. It was more of a shack, with warped wooden walls and a sagging roof barely holding against the storm. But it was shelter, and that was all we cared about. There were 5 of us: myself, Sam, Ellie, Mike, and Sarah. We crowded inside, shaking off the snow and stamping our frozen feet. The cabin was barren except for a dusty fireplace, an old iron poker, and a single wooden bench. There was no power, but we managed to start a fire with the kindling we found. The warmth was a blessing, but the storm outside only grew fiercer. Night fell quickly. The wind screamed, rattling the cabin's walls, and snow pressed against the windows, making the small space feel even more claustrophobic. As we sat huddled by the fire, someone noticed it. "Did you see that?" Ellie whispered, her voice trembling. "See what?" Mike asked, looking around. "The shadows. On the wall." We turned to look. The fire cast long, flickering shapes across the wooden planks. At first, it seemed normal, just the movement of the flames. But then I saw it too. One shadow moved against the light, independent of the others. "It's just the storm," Sarah said, though she didn't sound convinced. But the shadow grew more distinct, stretching and twisting like it had a mind of its own. It slithered along the wall, then darted into a corner and disappeared. "That's not normal," Sam muttered, his eyes fixed on the spot where the shadow vanished. The atmosphere grew heavier, the cabin colder despite the roaring fire. The shadows began to multiply. They moved erratically, creeping along the walls and ceiling, always just out of reach. "Maybe it's the wind outside," I offered weakly, though deep down I knew that wasn't it. The storm outside seemed to respond, roaring louder, almost as if mocking us. The cabin groaned under the weight of the wind, and for a moment it sounded like distant laughter carried on the gusts. Then the fire sputtered. The flames didn't go out entirely, but they dimmed, casting the room in an eerie half-light. The shadows became darker, more defined. One stretched across the floor toward us, its shape vaguely human but wrong, its limbs too long, its movements too smooth. Sarah screamed as it stopped inches from her boots. She grabbed the fire poker and swung it wildly, but it passed through the shadow as if it wasn't there. "What do they want?" Ellie cried, backing into the corner. The wind howled again, and for a moment I thought I heard words in it, soft, guttural whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "Get out," I whispered, translating the words aloud. "But we can't," Sam shouted, gesturing to the blizzard outside. "We'll freeze to death." The shadows didn't care. They began closing in, circling us like predators. The fire flickered again and the temperature dropped sharply. My breath came out in white clouds and frost formed on the edges of the wooden walls. We had no choice. Grabbing whatever we could, we threw on our coats and burst into the storm. The cold was unbearable, the wind like knives against our skin, but the moment we stepped outside, the cabin behind us fell silent. When we turned back, it was gone. Not destroyed, not collapsed, just gone. The spot where it had been was now an empty clearing, the snow untouched as if no one had ever been there. We never spoke about what happened that night, but none of us went hiking in winter again. And sometimes when the wind howls against my windows, I hear faint whispers and see shadows flickering, just at the edge of the light.